Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Wednesday, January 16th, 2019. And there's now a corporate truth police looking at the internet every day, monitoring independent media outlets, and rating them with a green thumbs up or a red thumbs down. Now, this story broke last week, and we have to credit MintPress News, the scrappy independent media outlet run by Manar Mohawish, based in Minneapolis. And they had been contacted by this emerging organization, which is founded by Stephen Brill, who's been around before. And this is a for-profit effort to police what they consider to be the scourge of fake news on the internet. But of course, when you compare corporate news with independent news, there are often many divergences. And there are stories the corporate media won't touch, and they want to be able to basically be the gatekeepers for what Americans can and cannot see. And the formal announcement today on the homepage of the New York Times, headline, "Veterans of the news business are now fighting fakes." Newsguard, according to the article, says it may have a solution to fake news. The effort is led by a pair of veteran news executives, Stephen Brill, author and founder of the magazine The American Lawyer, and Gordon Krovitz, a former publisher of the Wall Street Journal. And today they announced that it has signed Microsoft as its first major client, and Microsoft will be embedding the Newsguard app in its products for Android phones. We're told that they're going to be rating 2,000 news and information sites, red for unreliable, green for trustworthy. A team of 50 journalists and analysts is making the evaluations, but we don't know who these people are. We don't know what their backgrounds are, what their biases are, and who they believe they need to protect from information that they find, out of the mainstream. And according to this Times article, sites to watch out for, according to Newsguard, include InfoWars and Breitbart on the right and Daily Kos on the left. Media Matters, the left-leaning advocacy organization with a prolific media watchdog blog, has received a green rating, but scores negatively on 4 of the 9 criteria used by Newsguard. Now, Media Matters is a political organization. It was founded by David Brock. He has moved on. But it is clearly a Democratic-supporting media watchdog. And I use some of Media Matters material when I find it credible. But they have an agenda. And Daily Kos is purely opinion. Why would that draw a red flag from Newsguard? Now, I get emails from Daily Kos all damn day long. And I look at the headlines, but mostly I consider it to be partisan commentary. And I don't believe that requires a red or a green tag. Newsguard is offering the service free to readers. Not really sure what the business model is, but the Times published the scorecard that Newsguard used to rate NBC News. And under the credibility column, it says, does not repeatedly publish false content. Well, if you listen to my critique of Rachel Maddow and the Russiagate telenovela, you can't possibly give credit to NBC for not repeatedly publishing false content. Gathers and presents information responsibly. Well, again, that is subjective. One of the elements that I think is irresponsible about MSNBC's coverage is that they leave out so much of what is important that's going on in our country, even if it is oriented toward left-wing or Democratic viewers. Credibility regularly corrects or clarifies errors. Handles the difference between news and opinion responsibly. Well, honestly, I could not, in good conscience, give a positive rating to NBC or MSNBC on any of those criteria. And so this effort to provide some sort of a standard, a guideline for people to decide what they can trust and what they can't? It fails for the very same reason that so many other efforts to censor or police public expression have failed as well. So Newsguard has raised about $6 million so far, and its biggest corporate backer is Publicis, an advertising agency holding company. What is their concern? Well, their ads get tagged to what is considered to be troubling or fake news reporting. And so they want a way to say, well, we only place our clients' ads on sites or outlets that have been rated green by Newsguard. Now, the final blow here to the First Amendment is from co-founder Krovitz. He said, we'd be very uncomfortable if the government were mandating anything with regard to news. That would violate free speech values. You have the First Amendment. But Mr. Krovitz, how does that apply to Newsguard? You're not subject to the First Amendment? You're not violating free speech by arbitrarily deciding what is credible and what is not? And Vanguard is one of many issues that I discuss in my latest in-depth interview with Max Blumenthal. I have a lot of respect for this young reporter who, at the beginning of the interview, rejects the tag of being young anymore. But Max and his colleagues over at Gray Zone Project have done an incredible job. They got leads from hackers in Europe who exposed documents about this British-based organization called the Integrity Initiative. Its purpose is to fight Russian disinformation. But the research and the investigation shows that this is a project of the British military intelligence arms. And in the interview, I ask him about a British fellow who makes a cameo appearance in two of the recent articles that Blumenthal has co-authored about the Integrity Initiative. And this is a guy who showed up in the Bernie Sanders campaign in Iowa in 2016, a Brit who was just traveling in the U.S. and decided he would check it out. His name is Simon Bracey Lane, and we now know that he is deeply involved with the Integrity Initiative. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Max Blumenthal.
It indicates that Bracey Lane was conducting a special study of Russian interference in U.S. elections at the time, possibly, that he was working on the Bernie Sanders campaign. Could be that he just went back to London and conducted that study based on what he had learned, but how would he know anything about Russian interference? And how is the study special? It's not implausible that the British had put a covert asset in the Bernie campaign to just keep an eye on a self-identified socialist candidate who was considered not necessarily as favorable to NATO and the EU as Hillary Clinton was. It's very possible that they were just keeping an eye on things. We've learned in recent weeks and months and even recent days that the Donald Trump campaign was indeed wiretapped, that the FBI did put a confidential asset, Stefan Halper, in the Trump campaign, that the FBI opened an investigation on Trump, not just for firing James Comey, which is a strange reason to launch an investigation itself, but also because the RNC platform was changed to move it into line with the Obama administration's policy of not sending arms to Ukraine. That seems like a strange precedent for launching an FBI investigation. So this was going on in the 2016 campaign.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Max Blumenthal. It is really eye-opening in so many respects. And among other things, we talk about how Sebastian Gorka, a former White House staffer for Trump, is now on the Sinclair television network every day. He also now has a 3-hour daily radio show on the Salem network. And he was a top contact of Chris Donnelly, the British guy who runs the Integrity Initiative, when he made a trip to Washington last fall. We also talk about the American propagandists John and Rick Rendon of the Rendon Group. They were paid $100 million by the Bush administration to sell the Iraq War and some of the phony elements in the run-up to that. And there are other mind-boggling elements to this that I encourage you to check out. The interview is posted later today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spreaker. One of the other things I mentioned to Max in the interview, I picked up watching Fox News last week, and I don't do that on a regular basis, but sometimes I feel just the urge to know what's going on over there. And I saw a promo on Fox for a new series called Black Eye, subtitled Dan Rather and the Birth of Fake News. So if you look at Fox, which, by the way, gets a green rating from Newsguard, just like NBC did, they seem to want to train their viewers to believe that fake news was invented by Dan Rather when, according to the right wing, he falsely published information about George W. Bush's service in the Texas Air National Guard, where he dodged the war in Vietnam. And as we know, and Max and I talk about it in the interview, Dan Rather was set up. They basically put in a document that had the same evidence as the original document, but they were able to pull the thread on it and say, look, this is fake. The font on the IBM Selectric had not been invented at that point. And that's what brought down Dan Rather. So it is stunning when you see the array of propaganda, and you see the propagandists use similar themes. Fox, Newsguard, NBC, the New York Times. We are in a world of hurt and a world of disinformation. Yesterday, as expected, the Parliament dealt a colossal setback to Prime Minister Theresa May, rejecting her Brexit package by a huge margin, 432 to 202. Now, there is a no-confidence vote launched by the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. And the experts, they're people who know British politics better than I, they suspect that she will survive this no-confidence vote. But March 29th is coming pretty quickly, and that's when a hard Brexit would occur, leaving Britain truly reeling from its self-inflicted wound as it tries to separate from the European Union. And the New York Times has a single paragraph that helps Americans understand the breakdown in the Parliament. One faction advocates a more complete and abrupt break from Europe than the one the Prime Minister has negotiated with leaders in Brussels. Another supports May's plan, and another wants a softer Brexit than she has proposed, and a fourth still hopes for no Brexit at all. Now, as an innocent bystander here, tens of thousands of miles away, it sure looks to me like the way out of this is to have a new initiative, a new national referendum, and allow British voters to decide after a 2-year process here whether they still want Brexit. That seems reasonable to me. So what is also fascinating is that Jeremy Corbyn, he comes up in my Max Blumenthal interview because he has been the subject of various smears that could come from either the Integrity Initiative or people who are aligned with it. But what's fascinating is, to date, Jeremy Corbyn has not taken a position. I just laid out the 4 different options for the Parliament members to take about Brexit, and he hasn't committed to any of them. He has simply opposed Theresa May. And now that she is not on her heels, she is on her arse, he is somewhat more influential. I don't want to say he's in the driver's seat, but if he does succeed, and the no-confidence vote is scheduled for a couple of hours from now, so I won't know about it and be able to share it with you till tomorrow, but Corbyn has the opportunity here to play this, lead to a new general election, sacking the Conservatives and bringing Labour to power for the first time in ages. So we will see how all that plays out, but it was stunning but not surprising what happened in Parliament yesterday. We are learning that a suicide bomber in Manbij, Syria, staged an attack that killed at least 4 U.S. soldiers. This happened today inside a restaurant in Manbij where U.S. troops have been hanging out. We admit to 2,000 who are supposed to be training those Kurdish fighters that the Turks want to eviscerate, and this complicates things further. And we don't have enough information to know, but we can speculate that the Islamic State did this. They're taking credit for it because they wanted to send up a real signal flare to Trump saying, this war isn't over and we have not been vanquished. But it also could have been staged by Turkey as a message saying, get the hell out of here now. And there are many other possibilities here, so we will continue to look and remain skeptical and with our eyes open as we look deeper into this. My friend Dar Jamail has a new book that has just been published. It's called The End of Ice. And I want my Bay Area listeners to know that on Saturday, February 2nd, Dar will be here, and I'll be interviewing him at the First Presbyterian Church in San Anselmo. I've known Dar since 2004 or 2005 when he was an unembedded reporter in Iraq covering the war and occupation. And at Truth Out, he has been covering the climate change issues that form the foundation for his new book. And an excerpt published yesterday that I've linked to in the show file for today's podcast is, words fail me. The situation is really dire. We may have already warmed the earth in an irreversible way that could lead to the extinction of us. And he points out that every day hundreds of species are dying off on this planet due to human-caused warming. And the experts who he interviews, like Bruce Wright in Anchorage, Alaska, a senior scientist with the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association, we're not going to stop this train wreck, he assures me grimly. We are not even trying to slow down the production of CO2, and there's already enough CO2 in the atmosphere. Then he traveled to the Brazilian rainforest and got similar, very discouraging commentary. And he basically has been to many of the key points, looking at the coral reefs, looking at the warming of the oceans, and the prospects really are just very, very severe and scary. And I don't try to be an alarmist or, shock people in that way. I may be older than many of our listeners. I figure I've got another 20 or 25 years on this planet, and I am going to be seeing, we're projecting that 2030 is going to be a scene of a lot of shocking sea level rise. And by 2040, we are going to see the human habitable landmass shrinking dramatically. So I, again, want to invite you to take a look at Dar's book, The End of Ice. And if you are in the Bay Area, I invite you to join us for what I think is going to be a fascinating interview on Saturday, February 2nd. The start time for that event is 7:30 p.m. And every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Oh, great people like Brian Mazzy. Congratulations on your new child there, Brian. David Polson just renewed his annual subscription. Thank you, David. And we've got Benny Alto with multiple $5 subscriptions, and Arlene Montemarano, who kicks in $10 a month. Can you do that? I'd appreciate it if you can. All you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, then click on Become a Subscriber. You jump to the sign-up page, and it's pretty easy to figure out what fits your budget. And I hope you'll do it, and do it today. So every Wednesday, I produce a Spanish-language radio show here at the Secret Studio. And during the show, I work on the news stories that I'm going to bring to you in the podcast. And I was astounded when I saw the New York Times report on the El Chapo trial, and testimony delivered Tuesday indicates that the most recent president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, took a $100 million bribe from Joaquin Guzman Loera, also known as El Chapo. Wow, $100 million to the sitting president of Mexico. But then we look at the other report in the Times today on international drug lords. And we look at the white-collar oligarch criminals of the Sackler family right here in the United States. And their legal drug racket, centered around OxyContin, has earned them billions of dollars, making them one of the wealthiest families. $13 billion in profits from OxyContin is one of the estimates. Their names are on art galleries, and they're great philanthropists. And the family has kind of kept arm's length from its company, Purdue Pharma. And they created the perception that the Sackler family wasn't directly involved in management at least since 2007. And Richard Sackler, CEO, wrote a memo to staff back in 2001 because that was when the first problems with addiction and overdose and deaths started to surface. And Sackler wrote, "We have to hammer on abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals." Well, the reckless criminals are the Sacklers and their employees who were instructed to tell people that there's very little risk of addiction and that, black market sales of these opioids were unlikely because it was such a long-acting drug. And so these are lies. And these lies formed the basis of an enterprise, a racketeering enterprise, that earned millions of profits for the Sackler family. Now, back in 2007, they pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges that Purdue had misrepresented the dangers of the drug, and they paid about $630 million in fines. But nobody was criminally held liable. So about a year ago, Maura Healey, Massachusetts Attorney General, sued 8 members of the Sackler family. This has led to discovery of some of the communications, including what I just quoted. And so what we're learning is that they were directly involved. They were aware of the negative impacts of their most profitable drug, and they didn't stop. Meanwhile, the war on some drugs has hit another bump, as one of the DEA's described as a star agent, Jose Irizarry, has been accused of conspiring with a longtime DEA informant to launder more than $7 million in illicit drug proceeds. And that's just the criminal behavior that we know about at the DEA. Over on Capitol Hill, there are a couple of confirmation hearings, and the Democrats are not putting up a fight, at least not on the Bill Barr nomination to be Attorney General. I went home last night expecting to see sparks flying and, dramatic questioning from some of the more pointed Democratic senators. Nah. I caught Dianne Feinstein on her second round of questioning of Bill Barr, and it was so chummy, so cozy, it could have been held at a private club somewhere. And she even sent a food care package from her seat on the dais down to the well where Barr was seated, aimed at his grandchild who was there to witness Grandpa's testimony. And they went through all kinds of stuff back and forth, and Barr is very accomplished. He knows how to fend off a question and just avoid answering it. And he said things the Democrats want to hear. He won't be bullied. He wants Bob Mueller to be able to finish his work. But it's interesting. The New York Times ran a story that, when I printed it out, is 9 pages long. And they waited until page 9 to identify the most serious problem that surfaced in the questioning of Bob Barr yesterday. Let me read the quote. "The fate of Mueller's findings and expected report was a recurring topic. Mr. Barr said that Mueller's report to the Attorney General would be confidential, but that the Attorney General would then produce his own report to Congress based on that material. He said that he intended to be as transparent as possible, given grand jury secrecy rules, but he wouldn't let the White House editor change it. He's going to do that himself." And this is one of the things I have been warning about for years now. What is the end game of Mueller? He writes a report. He gives it to his boss at the Justice Department. And then it's a matter of trust. And do you trust Barr? I sure don't. He is a movement conservative, Republican, made man in the in the deep state, former CIA guy, worked for Bush at the CIA, central to Iran-Contra. But none of that was brought up by the overly polite and passive Democrats yesterday. Now, there was a little tension in the hearing to confirm Andrew Wheeler, who's been the acting director of the Environmental Protection Agency since Scott Pruitt got the boot last July. As you may know, Andrew Wheeler's been through the revolving door a couple of times. He worked as a Senate staffer to climate change denier James Inhofe of Oklahoma. Then he went into private, remuneration as a lobbyist for the coal industry. Yes, for Murray Industries, if I have it correctly. And he is not apologetic about what Pruitt started and what he is continuing to simply neutralize the Environmental Protection Agency. Last year saw a drop in their enforcement actions to a level we haven't seen since the Reagan administration. And Bernie Sanders, to his credit, pressed Wheeler on whether he agreed with Trump's comment that climate change is a hoax. And the most he would say is, I would not have used the hoax word myself. But when asked if climate change is a crisis, he said, I would not call it the greatest crisis, no, sir. I would call it a huge issue that needs to be addressed globally. Well, let's send him a copy of Dar Jamal's new book, The End of Ice. This kind of tweaked Trump today, I'm sure. But Nancy Pelosi sent a letter over to the White House saying, you shut down the government, and we've got this State of the Union message coming up on January 29th. But you laid off the people who would plan the security to protect you as you come to a joint session of the Congress to deliver your teleprompter speech in a wooden manner. Now, Steny Hoyer apparently picked up this letter. He's the number 2 Democrat, and he said, the State of the Union is canceled. I don't think we've gotten that far in the back and forth, but it could happen. And there are options. Trump could submit a written text. He could give an address from the Oval Office, and then he wouldn't have all those Republicans standing up repeatedly to clap for him. So we'll see how all that plays out. Yesterday, an unusual move in the Senate, where 11 Republicans joined all the Democrats to advance in a procedural vote, a measure that will be voted on in a formal manner today. And this uses congressional power to reverse a decision made by the Treasury Department to ease sanctions that had been imposed last year on companies controlled by the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Now, I don't approve of this backroom operation of easing those sanctions. At the same time, as you know, I'm quite a skeptic of the whole Trump-Russia narrative and the value of these sanctions to begin with. But I will commend the Senate because this issue has peeled off 11 Republicans from their loyalty to Trump. And that is a behavior, like training a dog, that we need to repeat and give them treats. I give my dog Chloe cookies. And she knows that the next time she does that behavior, she's going to get another cookie. Today in the New York Times, they basically reprised the story that was in the Washington Post yesterday. And this is pretty common in the Russiagate coverage, where the Times will break a story and the Post runs it on day 2. And yesterday it was the Post that broke the story about how interpreters had their notes taken by Trump, who told them not to discuss with anybody what he talked to Vladimir Putin about in their one-on-one meetings. Now, I acknowledge the optics of this look pretty bad. And I can't explain why Trump needs his secret meetings with his bro, Vlad. At the same time, this is speculative, circumstantial attack. Because so far, we don't have any evidence that something illegal or something inappropriate or something that remains secret, well, if it's still a secret, I'll take that back. But we don't have any indication that something bad happened in a private meeting between Trump and Putin. And the New York Times uses it to cite its own reporting, which it recycles, the article last weekend where they inferred that Trump was working for Russia because of the counterintelligence investigation that was launched after Comey was fired. And I consider this to be just incestuous reporting. Sure, as I acknowledged, there is circumstantial concern. But beyond that, it's just a lot more hot air. And of course, I believe that we have adequate basis to impeach Trump right now, and it's a lack of political will, starting with the Democrats, that prevents it. We know that he violated the Emoluments Clause from day one, and today, the Inspector General of the General Services Administration says that the GSA ignored serious concerns that Trump's lease on the post office in Washington, where he put his Trump International Hotel, violates the Emoluments Clause. The agency didn't even examine the Emoluments Clause, apparently, when it ruled that the lease with Trump was okay. And here's just kind of Exhibit A in the emoluments case. T-Mobile is trying to get the Trump administration to approve its proposed $26 billion merger with Sprint. It would more than double T-Mobile's value. And in order to get the approval, their executives have been spending a lot of time and money at that Trump International Hotel 5 blocks from the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue. And their outspoken celebrity chief executive, John Legere, who once had a beef with Trump and said he wouldn't stay at his hotels anymore. This goes back to 2015. Legere tweeted, "I will obviously leave your hotel right away." And he went to another hotel and said, "I'm so happy to wake up in a room where every single item isn't labeled Trump." But in order to secure his merger, he'll kiss Trump's logo. Also, while we're talking about wireless phone companies, Verizon, which once just 10 years ago featured Bill Barr as its general counsel, well, it's got a reputation for union busting and hostility to organized labor, and they're not shy about sharing that with their workers to try to prevent them from unionizing. They claim unions offer empty promises and unrealistic expectations, and that Verizon, which has hundreds of thousands of employees, prefers to work with them one-on-one. Oh, I'll bet they do. I'll bet they do. Great story at The Intercept today by Rachel Cohen. I don't ordinarily cover local teacher strikes, but the one in Los Angeles I think is significant. There are 30,000 teachers who have walked out after 2 years almost of contract negotiations led to no deal. And they're not only looking for raises and to restore librarians and psychologists and nurses to schools that have been cut over the years, they're also fighting charter schools. And this produces a real problem for Democrats because they're straddling. They support public schools, they support the teachers, but they also, a lot of them, support the charters. And I encourage you to read the piece because she does a good job of putting some of the Democratic presidential contenders on the spot about that issue. Also, I was surprised to see over at BuzzFeed today, a place where I usually find listicles and a lot of tabloid celebrity trash, but a thoughtful piece written by Emily Tamkin and Alexis Levinson, 2 different reporters, takes a look at the Democratic Party and the Israel-Palestine struggle, and particularly with boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and the new members of Congress like Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and Ilhan Omar from Minnesota openly supporting BDS. That puts pressure on a lot of Democrats to stop straddling, to stop being totally loyal to Israel. And it suggests that the 2020 campaign could open up some hot debate about BDS and about Israel and Palestine. And finally today, I want to thank listener John Zwiebel in Hawaii for checking in and offering a big rebuttal to an item that I featured here yesterday from Naomi Wolf. And by the way, I owe John a big apology. For years now, he's been a supporter. He's a frequent commenter on the podcast, and I've been mispronouncing his name. And finally, last week, he straightened me out. It's Zwiebel, not Zweibel. And John, I'm sorry about that. I try to honor people's names, including bozos who use their middle initials. Anyway, he correctly characterizes Naomi Wolf as a former Clinton-Gore operative, and her attack on the Green New Deal, which was really an attack on a memo that outlined it. She complained, and I recited this yesterday in summarizing her issues, that the memo she's talking about isn't a bill because the people who wrote it were not yet members of Congress. And Zwiebel also echoes my comment that when Wolf criticized the proposed package because it could create loopholes that leave them free to not have normal term limits. Now, we don't see anything in the document to support that, and there aren't any term limits for Congress. There has been discussion recently of putting term limits on the leadership, like Pelosi agreed to only serve 4 years as Speaker. But those are the only term limits I'm aware of that any members of Congress are subject to in any way, shape, or form. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. When there's a lot of news, I try to fit it all in. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.